Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you in the name of Medical Care Service for Refugees. We are a social medical human rights organization for psychosocial treatment for Center for Survivors of Torture and War. My name is Bianca Schmolze, and I'm responsible for human rights advocacy projects in our organization, focusing on refugees' rights and the rights of survivors of crimes against humanity to truth, justice, and integral reparation. With our work on Justice Heals, we promote the international fight against impunity and lobby for the rights of refugees guaranteed in the UN Convention relating on the status of refugees. With Medico International and the Institute for the International Law of Peace and Armed Conflict, we found two excellent cooperation partners to realize this digital series of lectures on the occasion of the 17th anniversary of the Refugees Convention. I would also like to thank the Foundation for Environment and Development North Rhine-Westphalia and Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for funding this project. Before we start, let me introduce you to my colleague Christina Rebsdorf, Senior Lecturer at the Institute.
Thank you very much, Bianca, for the introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. From me as well. It is a great pleasure indeed to be co-hosting this lecture on behalf of the Institute for International Law of Peace and Armed Conflict, which is one of Europe's leading academic institutions to conduct research on humanitarian crisis. As a senior researcher at the Institute, I most recently studied the localization of humanitarian action in forced migration context myself, for which I conducted field research in Lampedusa, Italy, and also Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. So, and not only for this, it's a really special honor for me to co-chair today's session, for which I'm looking forward to a lot, to discuss this important topic with our distinguished researchers from different world regions. During the first sessions of this lecture series, we explored the history of the Refugee Convention itself and discussed also the functions of the international refugee law and its protection gaps. In today's sessions, entitled Protection in the Global South, the situation in first destination countries, we intend to pay special attention to the decolonization debate and have been in close contact with the LERRN at Carleton University, the local engagement refugee research network, a team of researchers and practitioners committed to promoting protection and solutions with and for refugees.
As Christina already said, in this third session, we will discuss refugee protection in first destination countries in the global south. Although the situation of refugees on their way to and in Europe has dominated media headlines for years, the vast majority of refugees remain in states of the global south. In 2020, 86% of all refugees were in so-called developing countries, 27% even in least developed countries. To keep refugees away, the EU prefers to make deals with states in the global south by convincing them to host refugees by receiving development aid and other financial programs. But this is not enough. Money cannot resolve protracted situations. The global north needs to change its policies regarding refugees. This session explores the role of first destination host countries in providing protection and offering perspective to those who have managed to flee from hardship in their home states, as well as those who do not have any means to leave their places of birth in search of a better life. We will hear about challenges for host countries to provide adequate conditions and/or long-term integration perspectives for refugees, specifically in protracted refugee situations. And we want to discuss perspectives of the global south regarding responsibilities of the global north and why host countries in the global south are systematically left alone in dealing with protracted refugee situations. We look forward to have three experts who will present the situation in the global south. There is Dulu Nyauro. Dulu Nyauro we cannot see for the moment because he's here with us on the mobile phone, but you will hear him. Dulu Nyauro is a senior lecturer and researcher in the Department of Political Science at Moi University in Kenya and coordinator at the Peace and Reconciliation Institute. He coordinates the MA degree program in forced migration at Moi University. Dulu is the team leader of the Kenya Geographic Working of LERRN network and has conducted research on displacement in Kenya, South Africa, and Somalia.
And I would like to introduce Urub Elabet. She's the principal investigator in Jordan for the Center for Lebanese Studies at the Lebanese American University, Beirut. She is currently the regional research coordinator of a project studying refugee-led initiatives in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, a project held in partnership with LERRN. She is an honorary postdoc at the Department of Development Studies at SOAS, and she also received a PhD in political economy of development studies at the same institution. In her research work, she has focused on refugees and vulnerable communities in the Middle East. She has taught several courses on development and livelihood and forced migration issues at various universities and has consulted for several UN agencies and international NGOs. And if I understand correctly, she's actually joining us today from our field research site. And it's also a great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Ranavilla Samadar, who's currently the Distinguished Chair in Migration and Forced Migration Studies at the Kolkata Research Group in Kolkata, India. He belongs to the critical school of thinking and is considered as one of the foremost theorists in the field of migration and forced migration studies. And his writings on migration, forms of labor, urbanization, and political struggles have signaled a new turn in post-colonial thinking. And we're very happy to have him here today.
So before we hand over the microphone to the lecturers, I just want to inform you that we are going to open to you afterwards for coming into discussion with you. So please use any opportunity to write under the F&A button your question and remarks at any time. Christina and me, we will sort them and then put it into discussion. So as we are going to record this webinar, we are not going to read your names. So don't be afraid of that. So, and now I'm very happy to hand over to Ranavilla Samadar, who will give you the first input for this webinar.
Thank you, colleagues. Am I audible? Is it okay? Okay. So thanks to Christina Roepstorff and thanks to all of you for the invitation. I must express my apology at the outset for, jumping the queue or requesting you to, reorganize the queue. And because of my physical and other, compulsions, and I apologize, but I'm grateful that you acceded to my request. When I got the invitation, Christina may have noticed, and I'm quite sure she noticed, that I was dilly-dallying with my reply, not in the sense that whether I would join or not, but what do I say? One of the reasons being that 70 years of the Geneva Convention, I must tell you very frankly, didn't ring any bell. I mean, 70, 80, is it at all relevant? Who cares for what happened in 1951, etc. So I kept on.
Ranavilla, just very short, can you come a little closer to the microphone?
Okay. So
thank you so much. Thank you.
When I was getting these emails and I was trying to postpone the inevitable, and I must thank Christina that I at least, partly escaped the duty of writing an abstract. And I sent my, bio note. And believe me, I am not, telling in jest that this whole sense of, the purpose of commemorating or using the occasion, etc., apart from the institutional reason of agencies like the UNHCR, it eluded me, it still eludes me. So my second apology for that. But it doesn't mean that I have no response to the points that you have raised, that I regularly studied it, and therefore take my remarks with, how would I put it, you like. I consider the theme to be very serious. It's a serious theme. It should be studied. We had just completed the 6th annual research and orientation workshop, where one panel was on the 70 years of the Refugee Convention. And again, the reason being that people reminded us, do not forget that it is 70 years. And we had also another anniversary, which is the 50th year of the massive Bangladesh refugee crisis in the wake of the, Bangladesh Independence War. And for us, let us say Calcutans, at least, I'm not saying a whole of India, that probably is a much more vivid memory in terms of how do you recall refugee crisis or the current Rohingya crisis, refugee crisis, etc. So this global institution and the global, legal arrangement, beginning with the Geneva Convention, we must acknowledge and begin with an acknowledgement that it has differential significance. And it may not mean, so significant in some parts of the world as in others. I mean, I can quite presume, and I don't think I'll be very off the mark, since I have some idea and some relations with Palestinian peace activists in Lebanon, in Ramallah and elsewhere, where again, if you ask them significance of 1951 Refugee Convention, and you know that the 51 Convention has nothing to do with that. So at one level, therefore, the point that should be brought out is that the Geneva Convention has differential relevance. It claims to be global. And the fact that it claims to be global, therefore, should be taken with a pinch of salt. The researches on the colonial origins of the 1951 Convention bring out very clearly that the Geneva Convention was done in a way, it was framed in a way, the participation structure was ordained in a way so that it precluded crucial questions of colonization, decolonization, independence, third world countries, etc. And one of the biggest migration movements, forced migration movements in history after Indian partition between India and Pakistan, or as I refer to the Palestinian partition of Palestine, I don't think that they have any equal in the Geneva Convention. I do not think also that the text of the 51 Convention has anything to do, or even that they had something in mind. Even though I am aware of the proceedings, India was there in the beginning. India's response was up and down. It occupies a seat in the EXCOM, but India has not signed, and the countries of South Asia, none of the countries of South Asia have signed the 51 Convention. So this was the reason why I chose the title, The Post-Colonial Destiny of the 1951 Convention. It's in a way ironic, and I'm just going to take this 10-15 minutes, set out whatever I want to argue, is that irrespective, Eurocentric or Northern or Western towards the question of global care and protection, this convention, which has kind of an uneven life, has nothing but a post-colonial destiny to it. And the makers of the 51 Convention, I do not think that they expected it. But that's nothing wrong in the sense that after you frame a convention, it takes on its own life and you can only do so much. Now, if you see one of the greatest pointers to the destiny, and I shall end with just only one or two lines on what I mean by post-colonial destiny, but to arrive at that point, these prefatory remarks, which will take, in fact, most of the time to say what I can quickly say, is that the idea of the refugee and the idea of having an international institutional definition of refugee and following that an institutional mechanism of the protection of refugees is something that doesn't hold a great relevance today. One reason being, of course, that refugees, asylum seekers, illegal immigrants, migrants, cyclical migrants, all those categories which have been produced by what we may call, following Foucault, the government of moving people, the government of population movements, that has necessitated the production of the categories. While the reality, at least with the advent of neoliberalism, is that population flows have become mixed and massive. They defy categorizations. When we at the Calcutta Research Group started our annual, in those days, we used to have a 15-day winter workshop. We abjured, or we, didn't use deliberately the term refugee studies course or migration studies course, and we chose the term fixed forced migration. And you have an account of that in Chimney's, one of my dear friends, writing in the Journal of Refugee Studies, probably somewhere around 2010, where he actually acknowledges some of the points that we made. And it was only as late as, again, I'm not very good in remembering the year, but it should be 2008 or 2009, when the Unhcr finally acknowledged this phrase of mixed and massive population flows. Population flows are mixed and they're massive in number. Individually identifying and legally resolving who is a refugee or not is not going to work. It worked probably in the beginning, but it doesn't work in that way. All kinds of migrants and refugees are mixed. And that's the post-colonial reality. The important thing here, and which is kind of a twist in the fate of the Geneva Convention, is that when you see these massive flows of people across the Mediterranean, or for that matter, Bay of Bengal, Indian Ocean, or let's say from the south of the United States, let's say trying to enter the belly of the beast, it is impossible to distinguish who is an illegal immigrant, who is an asylum seeker, who is a refugee. When would he or she be considered as a refugee? And when I wrote and published in 2016 the post-colonial nature of Europe's data and migration crisis, I wanted to make the point, and our Greek colleagues, had organized 2-3 rounds of discussion on the relation between the date question and the migration question in Europe. And if you think of the, map for a while, closing our eyes, you will see that what you see kind of the population movements across the Mediterranean from the south, from the Maghreb region or down from sub-Saharan Africa, or from the east, from the war fields extending up to Afghanistan. From both the directions, people are moving towards Europe. Now, this is not a scenario that the framers of the Geneva Convention could have imagined, or I don't think they were very historically minded, except that they're very, their history was very short. It never, went beyond the League of Nations period. And now this is only the tip of the iceberg, because actually what you see is a massive tectonic shift in terms of population flow moving towards Europe. And you may say that Europe, in some sense, is revisiting its own colonial past, where from the east and from the south, with the history of the boundary making exercises. Think of the Berlin Congress, where the African boundaries were, done. So Europe is reliving, and it's a secular thing. It's not subject to temporary, kind of managing here and there. And in that sense, any Foucauldian notion of governmentality, where governments are able to determine a ratio between what is doable, not doable, proportion between different categories, different policies, cost and benefit, all these kinds of ratio making exercises are defeated today. So when I say that there is a post-colonial destiny to the 51 Convention, it is not only in a negative sense. It till now seems that I am only speaking, but this is one. The the other thing is that 51 Convention doesn't take war very seriously. This is strange because it was in the post-Second World War concept. The Second World War had just concluded. It was framed in the perspective or in the background of Cold War. Yet, if you read the 51 Convention, war does not feature prominently. So in terms of what are the forms of violence, I understand that daily violence, endemic violence, they do produce displaced people or displaced population groups. But today what you see, following, let us say, the introduction of the mandate system after the League of Versailles, so the French Accord and the British, and which the poison fruits that we are reaping today, or think of the Great Game and its continuity in Afghanistan. It is war with a very poisonous combination of climate change and what we argued when the internal displacement, the guiding principles of on the IDPs were being framed, and they came to Calcutta. We had a long discussion. Our website has huge amount of discussion right from the beginning of 2001 to, you will see that we had been arguing that it's a combination of these two, that if you do not take into account that, framing policies would be impossible. But on the other hand, precisely these population flows are a reality produced out of, as I said, war that the 51 Convention has to cope with. It's no longer the kind of way in which populations were, thought of, flows were thought of in 1951 or for that matter. And add to that the ecological marginality of the people. I mean, we had just concluded research on 3 massive cyclones that the Sundarbans had in 2008, 2020, and 2021. And even the climate, change impact also is not uniform. And therefore, while the cry and shout may be much more in Glasgow and elsewhere, but the way it actually functions, the dynamics of loss, etc. My final 2 points. One is that the entire exercise of refugee protection, refugee definition, institution making, they are all, are being done under the shadow of what I may call the other self, kind of a bit of a Freudian description. The other self of this reality is the border and boundary making exercise. 51 Convention doesn't deal with, let us say, an international arrangements of how to manage borders or how to govern borders on the basis of human rights. It's based on sovereignty. Boundary making exercises precisely define and determine how would you treat the refugees? Refugees are not dependent on the condition or on the fact that they seek refuge, but their life and their fate, lives and fate or fates depend on how borders are managed. And it is there where you find that in case of Africa, in case of Asia, where borders are being continuously externalized. So the borders are not only at Europe's gate where Frontex is managing, but borders are in South Asia, borders are in deep inside Libya, sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So the colonial border making exercise has its lineage. And in this sense, therefore, when we say the first destination countries, you see the first destination country, let's say, the Afghan. The Afghan may have arrived in Iran or in Pakistan, and Pakistan, where we did study, we still have, we had a fantastic study by an Afghan who is still in Afghanistan on the mix of climate change, successive droughts and war in Afghanistan. Some of them arrive, they become truck drivers. In Iran again, but many of them, and quite a lot of them, would like to go to Europe. So the first destination is, in a sense, it's the name of an irony. They're trapped. And we now call them, this is the first destination. Because that is only through them. The refugee we always think refuge is a condition where you have landed. No, refugee is a condition in transit. If they arrive in Turkey, they want to go to Greece. If they arrive in Greece, they want to move forward. If they manage to get in, let us say, outside Poland, they want to go to Poland, then please, we should not think that they want to stay in Poland. So, and it's not a search for El Dorado. So we can't look it like that. So the border and boundary making exercises is the great shadow under which we have these so-called protection exercises. If all that is so, what does then 51 Convention mean for us, and why I'm saying it's destiny? Its destiny is not only in the sense that these realities show us what 51 Convention is all about, but no, there is a post-colonial twist to the whole thing, that if you look at the case laws or the case judgments in the southern countries, say for India, or courts in Pakistan, in Nepal, they are drawing on each other, and where the 51 Convention is supposedly a kind of a standard, a measure. It's a flag a global flag of protection. So it's in a way, again, if you which I do not want to use, if you think of a little more theoretical language, you may say that 51 Convention is like a floating signifier. It only signifies certain things in certain contexts. It doesn't have any significance by itself. In fact, if you try to find significance from within the text, you will be at a loss, and you will reach my position of skepticism, or say, what does it matter? We have many countries have not acceded. What does it matter? Still they do give hospitality, still they protect. At the same time, the institutions of these countries, they think that after all, 51 Convention flagged the question of protection, flagged the question of care. But precisely this practice of having a global symbol, at the same time local practices tells us that there is an unusual and very understudied or under-researched study of how the global and the local, they interface. What is the kind of interaction between the global and the local? And that is where you see that the regional conventions, whether it is Africa or Cartagena or other kinds of two-country arrangements, India and Sri Lanka, in resolving the question of statelessness, all these things will show you that the local dynamics do not necessarily flow from what we think to be global. And that is the greatest, in a way, if you want to draw satisfaction from 51 Convention, you can say that probably the framers of the 51 Convention never thought along that line. But on the other hand, the fact that local dynamics use it as a kind of flag as I said, it's a kind of a signifier which is floating, which doesn't have any standard meaning. A fixed meaning tells us that the 51 Convention, like it or not, has only a post-colonial destiny. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranavilla, very much for this very critical and very in-depth reflection on the convention on a more global level, but also already addressing the local dynamics and local practices and the interaction of the global and local. And I'm pretty sure that Dulo and Urup will also speak to that. And I would like to introduce now Dulo and give him the floor, Dulo Nyai Oro, who is going to speak on the protection of refugees and asylum seekers in mixed migration context, and looking at the experience of East and the Horn of Africa in more detail. So taking up also the issue of mixed migration flows that you already addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Prof, for flagging out some, I think, very, very relevant issues of post-colonial questions about migration. And I think that speaks to what, to my topic when I'm saying protection of refugees and asylum seekers in mixed migration context. If you look at I will explain what mixed migration context is, and we will definitely see the link with the post-colonial attempts to control migration. Next. So, okay, I have organized my presentation in, just about a few slides: introduction, background, migration trends, refugee laws and policies, refugee hosting practices, successes and challenges in what we have. Next. Now, talking about introduction, the reality is, as we celebrate, 70 years of 1951 Convention, forced migration persists. Actually, it has increased. According to Unhcr, by the middle of this year, we had 84 million displaced persons, and 26.6 are actually refugees, while 48 million are IDPs and 4.4 million are asylum seekers. Now, more than 50% of refugees and asylum seekers are in protracted exile and complex emergencies. Now, by this, I mean refugees who have been in exile for more than 7 years. And when we talk about complex emergencies, and this is a reality in the East and Horn of Africa, we are talking about where there is conflict, there are environmental issues, there are development issues, that all combine, to make migration, a preference for a majority of the population. And again, this is a post-colonial issue. One of the problems we have is intrastate conflicts, is because in many contexts, not only in the Eastern Horn of Africa, is the question of politics of identity. And some of these supra-identities that are being created are as a result of post-colonial ideas. Going back, you will see Eastern Horn of Africa, is both a producer and a host to millions of refugees and displaced persons. They are sending countries and they are destination countries as well. So that's a brief. The next one, Lisa. Yes, that is East Africa for you, the Eastern Horn of Africa. Now, what you will want to see, by the way, the Eastern Horn of Africa is probably bigger than Europe. And if you look at all the neighboring countries, except maybe Seychelles, all these countries surrounding the Eastern Horn of Africa are experiencing some form of conflict or another, including the East African countries themselves. But as you can see, they are contiguous, they border each other, and mobility is quite possible. This is a colonial creation, by the way. Let me point out, these boundaries that you see are colonial creations, except the one for Southern Sudan and Eritrea. Next. So I look at East Africa, East and Horn of Africa as a geopolitical region. There are two categories: the East African community, which is an economic community, and then the Horn of Africa, which is loosely, referred to as also a geopolitical region. You want to pick out that these countries share common economic, cultural similarity, and there's widespread mobility between them. People move, people are related, people share borders, so mobility is quite common between these countries. The region has a very young population, and this is critical because literature shows us that people who are likely to move are young. And in Africa, 65% of people are below the age of 35. Now, with poor economies, low income, and intrastate conflict, you can see why there is mobility, in the East and Horn of Africa. And this is why, again, it creates the scenario of mixed migration. There are people who move for various reasons. And the first reason may not necessarily inform, the first reason for moving may not necessarily inform the second reason of moving. So we have those people who move from one place to another. Once you escape conflict, you probably are looking for better life. That does not mean that you can't move, that if you escaped conflict from Somalia, then you should be stuck in Kenya when where there are no opportunities. I saw somebody ask in the box that there are people who are running away, to go to prosperous countries. The reality is that when you are in a mixed situation, like for example, in Somalia, you have conflict, and then you have drought, you have famine. What do? You have to escape. You have to look for a way out. So this is why in the Eastern Horn of Africa, the drivers of migration and displacement, are many, not one. As I mentioned down there, the intrastate conflicts we have in Southern Sudan, we have in Sudan, we have in Ethiopia, we have in Somalia and Burundi. So, and these are the countries that actually produce the most numbers. I didn't include the DRC here. Of course, the DRC is not exactly in the East African region, but it is one of the biggest producers of refugees in the region. Next. Now, what do I mean by mixed migration context? IOM says that mixed migration is a complex migratory population movement that include refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, and other migrants, as opposed to migratory population movements that consist entirely of one category of migrants. So we have all these are, to a large extent, some of these are legal categories and economic categories. We really don't want to have political categories, sociological categories, because this does not serve the governments well. But the reality is, it is very easy. These categories are fluid. You can move, just from an economic migrant to a refugee in one day. You can move, from just a labor migrant to an asylum seeker the next day. So these are fluid categories, even when as we talk. We know people who have moved as labor migrants only to become trafficked persons. And this is the reality in the East and the Horn of Africa. That is why migration flows are diverse and different, and they should be understood in that context. Of course, conflict remains the largest source of mobility, but we also have seasonal migration across border and within borders of communities because people are pastoralists. The other type of migration that is prominent within the region, it's partly prominent, I think, because the European Union gives it quite a lot of attention, is what they call irregular migration, which is most of the time undocumented migrants, trafficked and smuggled people. We hear the stories of people, who cross the Mediterranean or cross the Red Sea and lose their lives. And this is one of the reasons that it is said. Now, the problem with this is we most of the time we don't understand what goes into this. And literature tries to argue that, look, the costs of migrating from, say, Eritrea to Europe is not for a poor person. You can't afford that 12,000 euros that it takes you to bribe, So the argument that has been made is that probably it is the middle class or children or youth from families that are able to move, are able to pay for this kind of journeys that are actually moved. So there's a missing link there that we have not understood as researchers that could easily inform intervention on the undocumented migration. An example is, a research that was done in 2015, 2016 shows that, about 400,000 Somali migrants arrived in Yemen irregularly. There's also labor-related migration, especially towards the Gulf and the Middle East. And this is observed in Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, and Somalia. In order to understand the mixed migration context, we have to look at the drivers. So we know of violent conflicts. We know of low economic and human development. That is, normally when we say this, it probably means something much deeper. But on the surface of it, it simply looks like the lack of opportunities for the young population that live in this region. We know to a large extent human rights violation. One of the places, and this is hardly spoken about, it's the forced conscription in Eritrea that actually force young men to run away from Eritrea. It's not exactly poverty. It is that people are forcefully, required to join the army. And some people say that we also have a culture of immigration, especially within some countries, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and also environmental and climate change. These are the drivers. This is why we have mixed migration within the East and Horn of Africa. What does that mean? It means, next, it simply means that we have to have different legal regimes to deal with these different movements. So let us, leaving the mixed migration context, I'll revisit that. The East African, the East and Horn of Africa hosts a large number of displaced persons, which is to a large extent a testimony to the numerous violent conflicts in the region. The region hosts about 4.5 million refugees, and as we know, those of us who are in migration studies, most of the time these are just estimates. They are refugees who are never registered. They operate within the margin, outside the margins of the law, or as required. We have 4.5 million refugees and 8.8 million IDPs in East Africa. This is an increase of 230% in 10 years. And the main producers is Southern Sudan, Somali, DRC. And then the main hosts are Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya, who host the largest number of refugees in the region. I don't know if Lisa is lagging behind. I'm talking on displacement in the EHON. Next, the next one. All right, thanks. But refugees are to be found in both urban and rural areas, which have implications in terms of law. That is the data. This is why I was saying these countries are both producers, and destination countries. If you look at DRC Congo, they by around 2017, they had produced 720,000 refugees, but are hosting 490,000 refugees. If you look at Somali, interestingly enough, the people think Somali is so unsafe, yet Somali is also hosting 50,000 refugees, and some of these refugees are actually from Yemen. If you look at Sudan, the conflict in the west, Darfur and Kordofan, they produce almost 800,000 refugees, but they also host 1.1 million refugees, mostly from Southern Sudan and Ethiopia and Chad. And Southern Sudan is the biggest producers of refugees in the region, 2.2, but they also host 322,000. And then Uganda, which is hosting the highest number of refugees in the region, actually, I think in Africa, at 1.5 million. So that is the data. So now, next. Yes, legal and policy frameworks or regimes. We know most of these countries are actually signatories to the 1951 Convention and its protocol of 1967. Now, what I want to tell you is that even though they are signatories, it's simply that they signed, that they are asked to sign. It is not that the 1951 Convention holds a lot of water in protection in this region. They are also signatory to the 1969 OAU Convention, which virtually almost all African countries are signatory to. Furthermore, each of the member states of this region have their own laws, domestic laws, which includes, they have included as a matter of practice the 1951 Convention into their laws. However, I must point out that the 1969 OAU Convention remains the centerpiece for refugee recognition and protection in most African countries. Why? Because the 1951 Convention gives persecution as the only ground for seeking asylum. And this is not often the case within this region. What we witness in the region is actually widespread violence and public disorder. Like what is going on now in Ethiopia, what is going on now in Somalia, in Southern Sudan. If you tried to give asylum based on the 1951 Convention, you will exclude almost 90% of the population who cannot point out at persecution as the main reason. So this is a huge gap that remains in the 1951 Convention. The grounds for seeking asylum should probably be reviewed and revised. so that it enhances. But again, as my, the previous speaker pointed out, the 1951 convention was not set out to sort out, future problems. It was meant to sort out European problems arising from the Second World War. And this is why, sometimes many of the countries choose not to sign because it is not mandatory. Of course, one of the things that we pick out from the 1951 convention is the creation of the UNHCR, which has been very useful. So in our context, refugee status determination is done on a prima facie basis. That is on the face of it. And we know, for example, the country of origin information coming, say, from Southern Sudan or coming from Ethiopia points towards general, widespread violence, which make people flee for the fear of their lives. Not that they are targets, but they can be easily collateral damage within the conflict. The other reality is that government agencies dealing with refugees in the Horn or East Africa have very limited capacity, for example, to conduct individual status determination. If, for example, Ethiopia or Uganda has 1.5 million refugees, I don't think the government has the capacity to do individual status determination, or Ethiopia for that matter, with almost 900,000 refugees. And also, it is actually practically difficult because of the mixed nature of migration. It is difficult to categorize migrants. I will give you an example between Kenya and Ethiopia. There are people who are living in Ethiopia, not because they want to be refugees, but it's because they want to cross to Kenya to go down toward South Africa. So, but for ease of doing business, they simply say they want asylum, and they will probably stay in the camp, but find their way out. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that in our context, international and national humanitarian agencies are heavily involved in relief work for refugees and asylums, which means the government's capacity is limited. It has to be complemented, but it also means, there is that post-colonial thinking that, refugees in this context will only need humanitarian assistance. They don't need development. So that may speak to what EU is thinking, but it may also speak, to what the host governments within the region are also thinking. Some of the practices that we have: humanitarian principles. Host governments rely on humanitarian assistance to support refugees. And one of the key problems here is because of the protracted situation of refugees within the Horn of Africa, material assistance has drastically declined, putting host governments and host communities in very difficult circumstances. The last time I visited a refugee camp, I was told the food ration has been reduced by 50%. The countries have different policies. Even if they have similar laws, they have different policies. For example, Uganda has promoted self-reliance through self-settlement for refugees. The settlement schemes, refugees are actually allocated some land to till, and they are given farm equipment to cultivate for their own food, which most refugees prefer to relief, by the way. And this is why you will probably see that Uganda has 1.5 million refugees, unlike Kenya, which has promoted encampment policy, which has been restrictive for many years. However, since 2016, the government of Kenya has initiated an integrated economic and social development project, which is meant as a pathway towards local integration. It simply means that refugees are living together with the host community. They share social amenities, and the interaction is much more to build trust and to build confidence and to reduce discrimination, and also to reduce, some of the negative effects of the environment. Tanzania has promoted encampment policies and discouraged integration. However, they did one of the few countries that did, offer citizenship to 200,000 Burundi refugees in 2015. This is the cohort of refugees who were displaced from Burundi in 1972. Actually, majority of them were born in Tanzania. They had never been to Burundi. They had no connection to Burundi at all. Some of them took the offer, and some of them did. This still requires more research, because then how Tanzania has done it may provide us with opportunity, to try to understand how local integration can work better. Yes, the next one.
Dulo, perhaps could you finish in some minutes, because we also have Orup?
Yes, almost done.
Thank you.
Yes. So the challenges that we have: discrimination and exclusion from the labor market, for example, donor fatigue, shared responsibility between states is not observed. This is why Europe is trying development tactics, to stop refugees from moving. We have containment programs, which imposes a great burden. We also have, in the East and Horn of African context, there's a big problem with security, especially related to terror attacks. So a large number of refugees still need protection. Legal regimes that exist are adequate. Maybe we need to think a little more about local integration as a durable solution to the refugee situation in the host, in the East and Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dulo. So now we come to our last expert, that is Orup, who is now talking to us from Turkey.
Hi. You can hear me okay, isn't
yes.
it? Great. Thank you, Dulu. Very appreciated very much the ideas and the recommendation you presented. Something that definitely will talk well to my presentation. So the title of my talk is when we are talking about refugee protection, especially in a region that does not have. Give me 1 minute. Let me just control the. Hola. All right, here we go. In a region that a majority of its countries are not signatory of the 1951 Convention, I am to talk to you about how refugees are managed, and how the whole concept of protection has been dealt in that country, in these countries. Just before I move on, we're talking about, I'm going to focus in my talk about this Middle East, where we're talking about Syria, that's at the moment is under occupation, with conditions that hopefully will loosen up slowly. I'm sorry, I'm having a little problem with some technology. I'm talking about Jordan, I'm talking about Palestine, I'm talking about Lebanon. So for many reasons, for natural, for geopolitical reasons, for religious reasons, the Middle East has been one of the highest regions generating refugees. Funny enough to say that of 60 million displaced refugees, close to 40% of the refugees originate from our region, particularly the Syrians and, of course, the Palestinians. More than 50% of these refugees remain in the region. They cannot leave it. They are protracted in where they are, stranded where they are. And they have become, over the years, whether legally staying, whether with right or not right, they have become part of the social fabric. Many of these refugees find themselves in protracted refugee situation, falling out of the durable solutions that are often not applicable to them. Today, in the 21st century, Jordan and Lebanon are seen to be the second host countries of refugees in the Middle East. So quite dense countries with very limited resources and limited funding. So what does, in these circumstances, what does protection entail in this region? What does protection mean when we are talking about legal rights? How do we see the socio-economic integration, again, in light of this word, protection, that is very much embedded within the 1951 Convention? Or can we see that we ended up having, with the word protection, are we seeing it that it has shifted into a transiting status for the people waiting for a solution in a region where very few have signed the 1951 Convention? So that rather than really being protection, it has shifted into becoming a transiting, waiting status. In my talk, I'm gonna take you very quickly in a very quick understanding, very overview of our understanding of what do we mean by protection at the international level? And what do we mean by protection at the regional level in this Arab region? And what do we really mean by protection at a domestic level, at a little smaller scale? And in my second part of my talk, I will try to do just a reading through the factors that really matter in managing the hybrid population of refugees and citizens, and how these elements of frontierism, economy, labeling, politics, the one-pattern refugee burden that is very much related to the awkward protection that these countries are dealing with, and questioning the emergency and development nexus, and looking into the language of security today vis-a-vis refugees in order to close up my talk. In principle, there are two grounds that we really need to think of when we're talking about the 1951 Convention and the protection that's given through the 1951 Convention. And is the non-refoulement, where the countries are not permitted to send back refugees to their home countries, because this will be very much putting them at harm. And the second point is looking through the durable solutions. And what we mean by the durable solutions is the fact of sending them back to their homelands in case of a peace happening back in the homeland. The second point is local integration. And the third point is resettlement in case countries from the international communities are ready to resettle them. So while we're talking about these two grounds, very important poles in the 1951 Convention for the country signatory of it, we're having at the same time, and here I'm talking about what are we having while we are all celebrating the 1951 Convention, we're having an agreement like Barcelona Agreement, 1991, that very much called for the containment of the refugees in the region, where we are we're paying countries of first countries of asylum to keep refugees where they are. This is one. while we're celebrating the 1951 Convention with its thunder, full moon, and durable solutions, we just had few months ago, in fact last year, the European Commission coming out with a new pact on migration and asylum that was just out in September 2020, making sure that we need to make sure that the refugees should be out of Europe at all costs through the way of ensuring containment in the first countries of asylum, which is the global south, but also making sure that their stay should not last too long, so they don't become a burden on Fortress Europe. And I'm going to talk in a minute about Fortress Europe. While talking and celebrating of the 1951 Convention, we are seeing that the major countries that were very much supportive and funding highly the resettlements of refugees, such as USA, North America, and Scandinavian countries, today they are really revealing to us limited entry to their countries, with a very shy resettlement numbers in their programs and their quotas that they present on yearly basis to Unhcr, with the numbers that they can accept on their grounds, on their lands. So that tells us something when we're talking about the international level. How do we understand the 1951 Convention and the protection element it's providing? At a regional level, and here I'm talking about the Arab region with a focus on the Middle East. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of countries are not signatory of the 1951 Convention. And what happened in a country like Jordan, for example, when we had the mass influx of Iraqis in 1990, in the 90s, it started in 1991, there has been an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, that was signed between Jordan and the Unhcr in order to establish the grounds of treating, of managing the refugees on the Jordanian territories. Through this agreement that reiterated the grounds, once again, of the 1951 Convention of, first of all, the non-refoulement, second of all, the respect of finding solutions that will be addressed by the Unhcr and not by the country that's called Jordan, so that Jordan is not involved in the process of the local integration, because Jordan has been refusing it. And in a minute, I'm going to explain why. Same applied to Lebanon, despite the fact that Lebanon has been very much like Jordan, receptive of continuing. It was only in the year 2014 that an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, was signed between Lebanon and the Unhcr in order to give wider space for Unhcr to manage the abundance, the big numbers of refugees on the Lebanese territories, minimizing as much as possible the burden from the government of Lebanon. While having said that, there has been also a kind of contribution to support this region that has been flooded by mass numbers of refugees, particularly with the Syrian crisis, where a proposal of agreeing on the response plans, the response plans vis-a-vis the Syrian refugee crisis, aimed since 2014 between Jordan, Lebanon, and the international community to make sure that the action will be taken not in a very much of a relief emergency aid action, but into a very much of a development action in order to make sure that this will build up the state, the development, the economic development grounds of the lands, of the territories that are hosting refugees, and make sure that the locals who are living in these countries will also receive as good services and better services, even because these countries are hosting the refugees. So there has been this tendency of pushing in Jordan and Lebanon to go for the response plan, to better channel the funding from the international community, to better serve the refugees on their territories, and to ensure better services for the locals on their grounds. I'm going to move still, as we're talking about the regional level, one of the grounds that very much affected why a country like Jordan or a country like Lebanon, a country like Syria, not having been signatory of the 1951 Convention is the Palestinian refugee issue. There has been this kind of argument from the very beginning of the in the 50s that the Arab countries will shy away from signing the 1951 Convention because they don't want to amalgamate the Palestinian issue that they believed and they argued was created by the international community by supporting the Zionist entity, by creating the country of Israel. So by doing that, they wanted to make sure that they are leaving the burden on the international community and they're not assuming any kind of responsibility vis-a-vis the Palestinian refugees. Having this stance made these countries refuse to go into the durable solutions of accepting durable solutions, particularly the local integration, because local integration does allude to the fact that they will be naturalizing the refugees on their territories. And because they were making sure that they wanted to safeguard the identity, the Palestinian identity, they rather not to sign the 1951 Convention, so that by doing that, they are safeguarding the Palestinians and they're not assuming any responsibility that was caused by the international community. So this was one of the important elements that prevented these two countries from signing the 1951 Convention. But yet, there has been this kind of amalgamation, and amalgamation by the understanding, when does the 1951 Convention and the protection of the 1951 Convention apply to these Palestinians, and when does it stop? It stops when the refugees, the Palestinians, are within the 5 areas of UNRWA operations: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, and Gaza. As long as they are within this area, they cannot take the protection from the 1951 Convention. Yet, if they are in Egypt, if they are in Iraq, definitely the role of Unhcr and the protection within the 1951 Convention does apply on them. One of the amalgamation is that many people, and with a misreading of the Article 1D of the 1951 Convention, is missed out by realizing that Palestinians do not apply to this convention, but yet they do apply. And the work that I have done in Egypt, I tried so loudly to argue that in a country like Egypt, the 51 Convention does apply on Palestinians. The problem was the stubborn attitude by the state, by the political stance by the state of Egypt that was refusing to apply the 1951 Convention and the right of protection on the Palestinian residents on its territories, Egypt. Another element within understanding the regional ground, which I already mentioned to you, the argument of the Arab countries refusing to sign the 1951 Convention fell well within what's called, at an Arab level, within the Arab League, the Casablanca Protocol, which called to safeguard the Palestinian identity, and that was signed in 1965, where the Arab countries signing this agreement argued, which I mentioned to you earlier, argued that we do not want to assume the responsibility of naturalizing Palestinians because this burden was created, this issue was created by the international community, and we want the international community to assume their role vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So this scenario very much did create this stance against the 1951 Convention within the Arab region. At a domestic level, because of this scenario, where these countries are not signatory of the 1951 Convention, because of the scenario where these countries are very much limited with their resources, I am analyzing it that we ended up having the integration, the conditional integration of the refugees on the territories of the Arab countries of the Middle East, very much conditioned by certain elements. And these conditions where these countries were always making sure that receiving or having these refugees will not create an imbalance in the social tissue. And by that, I refer here, for example, to the Lebanese example that were not very much welcoming to more Sunni people to come to their territories. With the Jordanians at one point, they felt that they have over-received of Palestinian refugees, and this very much disturbs the social tissue. Secondly, it's very much dictated by politics, the politics that is very much led by the regime, the discretion of the hosting regime vis-a-vis these refugees who are coming to the territories, such as the politics vis-a-vis Palestinians in Jordan, such as the politics vis-a-vis Iraqis in Jordan. These are just but the model, or the politics of Palestinians vis-a-vis Palestinians because of the PLO and the war that happened in Lebanon vis-a-vis Palestinians. So that very much this politics amalgamated the stance of the regime vis-a-vis the political entity that represents the refugees and the refugees. That was this kind of amalgamation. This was very much reflected in the kind of limited rights given to the refugees, and by the limited solutions as a result, with the fact that they are not signatory of the 1951 Convention, but also standing still watching the protracted refugee situation with no action. But most importantly, these kind of stances were also dictated by the funding, and the kind of funding that's being channeled to what group and to who has it been channeled. In fact, I am in Turkey, and the same voice that I heard this morning from some refugees in Turkey, I hear it in Lebanon, I hear it in Jordan, where they're saying the refugee who's Syrian does not have the same rights that are given to the Yemeni, that are not given to the rights who is Sudan, to the Sudani, that are not given to the rights to the Palestinians. So this kind of fluctuation between rights that are not equal are very much of an issue that is making some people more privileged than the others. And for the moment, the most privileged, it's very ironic to say that, group has been the Syrians, because the international community has been flooding money to contain these refugees within the global south, which is making very much these refugees remain in this area. And they appear to their peer refugees that they are mostly privileged with the very limited rights that they're getting, yet they are seen to be privileged. Another element that is very much firing on our faces with the whole issue of the protection is, while having these refugees with their fluctuating rights, we're also having the crises, the economic crises, the socio-economic challenges that are very much encountering citizens within these host countries. And this is very much the socio-economic issues in Lebanon. Now we're having a major depreciation of the currency. In Jordan, we're having a major underemployment of locals. This kind of economic disturbance is very much creating a certain pejorative perception from the local communities on one hand, but also from the official media vis-a-vis refugees, which is very much shaking the whole issue of protection in the region. I mentioned to you earlier that the response plans that were suggested by the international community to both Jordan and Lebanon aim to very much shift away the funding coming from the international community to take it to a development level, so that this very much ensure the national resilience and the national capacity in handling and in managing the big crisis, but also in permitting, and here we come to a very important word, in creating a ground for the refugees to be active, with the word self-reliance. And that was engendered, particularly in Jordan, with signing the Jordan Compact in 2016, where it pledged that it will expand the livelihood for Syrian refugees through permitting them to be employed. And here we come to some critical issues about the employment. What did the host country meant by employing refugees? one of the things that we managed to notice is that lots of space has been given to the refugees to be self-reliant within an economy that's quite dodgy. And this space that was given to the refugees was given within certain sectors. Refugees in both Lebanon and Jordan are permitted to be either within the field of construction, agriculture, or some services, customer services. So by that, they just limited their action. They limited, I call it the one pattern image, where we have decided to make out of the refugees people that are not educated, people that have very limited skills that can be limited to this field. By doing that, this enabled the private sector in a way to commodify the refugees. Really, they became like a commodity because they became cheap product that you move them from one factory to the other, and you're exploiting their time, you're exploiting their energy. And that fell under the wider pledge of the international community to support these refugees into self-reliance within these countries of the Middle East, the Arab Middle East. Ironically enough, later, just 2 years after signing the Jordan Compact, the Global Compact on Refugees in December 2018 very much reiterated the grounds, of course, the solutions, finding the traditional solutions for refugees, and very much reiterated the kind of protection that needed to be provided for refugees. But the question is, how was that presented? It was put very much that of pushing refugees to become active in the trade, to become active within the private sector as producing of goods, which was very much representing in a country like Jordan, by the way, by creating what's called industrial areas, industrial zones, where refugees were asked, and once again, those refugees that we, the world, decided to make them one pattern image. They are just the very unskilled, they are not professional, they're just unskilled people that we are inviting them to join us in our created factories so that they are becoming self-reliant. Forgetting that not everyone can be in the industrial sector. And in fact, the models that we're having today in the northeast of Jordan with King Abdullah industrial zone, it's proving to us that this wasn't really tailored rightly to really render refugees self-reliant. It was very much tailored to seek to give services to the European, finding new markets and finding new cheap laborers to be involved in their businesses. So whom are we accountable to? Are we accountable to the international community with their expanding markets, or are we accountable to protecting refugees? I'm just putting here this up because this has been really the most important image that very much reflected the whole idea of the Jordan response plan or the response plans, where there was this emphasis that we want to give more education, more to the environment, more to the security, and we want to strengthen the infrastructure in order to be more hospitable and more accommodating to the refugees. Has this been really done? We know that it hasn't. I'm arguing that all this politics with the discretion of the state, with the failure of obliging community to be more accountable and more sensible to the vulnerable refugees, we ended up very much nurturing and engendering disparities amongst people. And I want to simplify, I'm finishing with the last few points. I'm going to simplify how this engendering of disparities, just anyway, I'm having something.
Uruk, looking also at the time, this is a fabulous presentation, but we would also like to give a chance to people to speak a bit. So maybe you can wrap up your last points in a bit. Or did we lose?
Oh, I think we lost her.
Oh, such a pity.
Okay, that was a forced ending.
Oh, that's not what I meant.
So perhaps she would come back, but time is nearly over. So to all participants, I beg for your understanding that we cannot make a too long discussion session. But of course, we would give you some minutes time to ask questions to the lecturers that are still here. That is Dulu and Ranavilla. And so we have 2 questions from the audience so far, and we will see if Urup will come back to us or not. Christina, I know that you have to leave.
Soonish.
So no problem. You just leave when it's your time, okay? So and we continue here with the discussion.
Well,
So,
looking here that looking at the question, I think the first one was already addressed by Dulo to some extent, and the second one is a request that we wait for Urup.
Yeah, of course we wait for her.
Wait for her, but I still, and we want her to finish. I still would think we should take the time now to ask some questions. So
yes, I think so too, as long as she is not back.
So because I'm sorry, there is Urup. So
perfect. Okay.
Sorry, Urup, that you we lost you.
Okay, good to see you, Urup. So we give you the chance to finalize your points.
I'm almost done. I'm really sorry.
No problem. That happens.
I'm in the hotel, and
if you can just speed up your last points so that we have some minutes also for questions.
Give me 1 minute. Okay, now. 1 second. 1 second. Oh.
Don't worry.
Okay, I can't see. Where's my talk now? All right, give me 1 minute. Okay, all right, my talk is here. We'll just do that. I just need to leave this page. Okay, can you see me still?
Yes, I see. We see you. Yes.
You see the PowerPoint?
So Lisa, did you give her the co-host?
Yeah. All right, let me make sure that you're seeing that. Yeah. All right, I'm sharing it again, and here we are. I'm really sorry for this.
No problem.
Technology helps us a little bit, not always. All right, so I was just saying, in light of all this, in light of these disparities, in light of all this kind of discretion that has been given to the host state, we are having these kind of nurturing of disparities, engendering disparities. And how has this become? How did that happen? Now, we're talking here about 2 countries, and we're talking about Jordan and Lebanon, that are very much with rentier economy. And the rentier economy is meant by it that they are dependent on remittances on one hand, and they're very much dependent on aid. By that, by the dependency on flowing income, flowing money, flowing aid, that managed easily to very much emphasize the politics of divisiveness. How? When the money is coming only today, and I am hearing it in Turkey, which is a very strong country when it comes to resources, I'm hearing it in Jordan, I'm hearing it in Lebanon, money has been very much labeled, channeled particularly to Syrians. Sudanese are not getting it, Yemenis are not getting it, Somalis are not getting it, and Libyans are not getting it. So that is telling us how this kind of rentierism economy has been very much been selective with the aid. And because these countries are quite weak, they have no choice but to abide by that. Secondly, and here I am as well finishing with that, because of this divisiveness politics, today we're having something called labeling. Syrians, at one point when the war happened, they were called guests and visitors. Iraqis, for almost two years, Jordan insisting in calling them guests and not refugees, until the money started flowing in. The state decided, and after signing the MOU with UNHCR, the state decided to treat them as refugees. So how funding matters, one, and how politics matters two, in order to shape the politics of the host country and the protection that the host country is doing vis-a-vis refugees. And this, accordingly, very much matters on the kind of rights that these refugees are able to get. Similar things applies to the issue of encampment. Countries have in a very subtle way, welcomed the creation of camps. In Jordan, we ended up having official camps. In Lebanon, we ended up having unofficial camps. The question about camps, countries sometimes, and we know that in the literature, they are important for countries because they render the burden of refugees visible for the international community. And therefore, this generates money. The point is, whose interest are we here calling for? Are we calling for the interest of visibility so more money can come to states? Or are we calling for more involvement and engagement of the refugees in the real social tissue? Same question very much is posed when we're talking about refugees. When they are living within an urban setting, again, where the state is claiming, the host states are claiming that we're permitting them to live within the urban setting because we're trying to include them in the social cohesion, in our social cohesion, are they really giving them enabling environment to survive the very hostility of the urban setting? We're not calling for them to be imprisoned or to be warehoused within camps, but what kind of incentives are they being given when they are living within the urban setting as refugees with very vulnerable conditions? I believe I did tell you about the very limiting one burden. I call it the one pattern refugee burden, because this is very much the idea of labeling the refugee as the weak. And by labeling the refugee as the weak, I am just limiting him within self-reliant, limited market. But well, what about the fact when the refugee is an engineer? What happens to the fact when the refugee is a lawyer? What happens when he's a real GP? So here we are questioning how the protection is being handled in the countries, and how this is very much engendering the disparities that is very much failing away from the whole word protection. That is very much has been the ground that shaped the 1951 Convention. I am just presenting these realities, putting up what kind of solutions can we propose? Can we propose more social solutions rather than legal solutions or political solutions to be more encompassing and more tolerant to the refugees on our lands? Can we just think of being more accommodating to the refugees by trying as much as possible in our difficult countries, police countries, to be more equal? With equality, maybe when we can deal with people on equal grounds, we are really addressing the major problem of protection. I'm finishing with that. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Urup. These are so important questions that we need to find answers very quickly. And I hope the discussions we have in the frame of this series of lectures will find some ideas for that. So thank you all three for your inputs. So I know we should have finished at 6, but I hope you have some minutes left for us so that we can give the audience the possibility to ask you some questions or to discuss with you some points. So there's a first one coming from the audience that I will read it to you. To what extent is there a distinction between a genuine refugee, for example, one who faces serious bodily danger in her own country, and a person who's just trying to steal her way into a more prosperous country? I think this has to do with this mixed migration we were talking about.
Dulu has already answered to that to some extent, but I don't know if Urup or Ranavilla want to add to what has already been said about this. I mean, it's very much linked to a discussion of this labeling and migration. Yeah.
I think the answer has already been given. So, in any case, who makes this distinction? I mean,
yeah, that's also these artificial categories that we were listening now in all your lectures. So yes, very.
I mean, it's also ironical that we always try to distinguish between the needy and the greedy. But the needy, precisely because they have needs, so they will have aspirations or they will have desires which we will term as greed. So in any case, this has been, shown to having no formulation. So it doesn't have any basis. I mean,
Yeah.
Maybe, as I said, I apologize already because I might have to leave soon, but I would like to take the opportunity now to ask a question also to Ranavilla, because at the beginning you had, the first presentation and you gave us some food for thought, and I think some of the aspects you raised were also then reflected. But maybe we can also zoom in to your region, and now that you heard the other speakers, maybe you can say something, a few words about the situation and protection in India or South Asia more generally, because also India is hosting a lot of refugees, and but is not a signatory of the convention. And do you find there similar dynamics, issues at play in the region, as you heard from the other speakers?
very, very briefly, okay. Am I audible? Yeah, very briefly,
Yes.
India's refugee policy, to the extent that it has a policy, owes a lot to the reality of partition. So the millions of people who came over to India from what became Pakistan and later on Bangladesh. So part of the country's tradition of hospitality and taking care, giving protection, this was shaped by the partition experience. And since by and large, India had to fend for herself, so in a way, this also reflected and this impacted India's attitude to the 51 Convention. In the Bangladesh case, in the partition case, what is remarkable is that almost all were given citizenship. And it was considered as a part of national reconstruction and putting the ghost of partition to rest. In case of the 71 crisis, or the Bangladesh, independence war and the refugee crisis, again, remarkable is the fact that probably 90 or 95% of the refugees went back, and there was no forced return. On the other hand, these two massive waves of migration, they in a way continue, but they continue in the sense that they continue in the informal way. The partition phase of partition is long over. The Bangladesh independence war and that too is 50 years over. So, but these flows of people, forced flows of people, were based on historical patterns of migration. So even though they were cataclysmic events, they were in a way great events, they were shock events, and they produced what in today's scientific literature in migration would be called shock migration. At the same time, they were also built on historically determined structures, so clan ties, kinship ties, caste ties, religious ties, linguistic ties, all those mattered in making the shelter seeker decide where to go, how to go, when to go, and network meant a lot. In South Asia, I would say, again, in my very brief remark, that network of protection and network of solidarity, network of, care, they mean a lot. And unfortunately, this has not been studied. While we know that refugee protection is a matter of customary law, at the same time, we have not studied how actually customary networks of protection work as great levers in terms of refugee protection by the hosting society. And in all these cases, these were massive cases of the 20th century migration history. The state played a role, very important role, but we must understand a greater role was played by the society, as I said, in terms of these groups. Two other very brief points. One is that by the 1990s, Indian state became increasingly more security oriented. globalization, advent of neoliberalism, and a more security-oriented approach towards protection policy, they combined, and they have become the dominant reality today. So India's record of hospitality is exceptional. And it's true that it didn't flow from obligations to 51 Convention, but at the same time, this is a record which is worth recalling to point out that our present, present decisions, etc., they are much more influenced by contemporary security situation. And something which has not been discussed is that this whole discourse of terrorism and the discourse of the Muslim who is a born terrorist is so much now prevalent and overwhelming in the entire protection discourse, global protection discourse, as I said, that in cordoning, in securitizing border, etc., that I don't think that India has been an exception to that. So if we had seen a high tide of in the protection ethos, we also see now the security case taking over. My final point is that with all these things, at the same time, I think the previous speaker said something on which at some point probably we'll have some discussion, that India's refugee policy and policy of protection and care show that protection and care, they have a very ambiguous mix of visibility and invisibility. It is not simply the requirement of getting money, but also the fact that in the 51 Convention, the refugee was considered as a politically visible person because he or she came from the other side of the iron curtain. And much political mileage was got out of that. Economically, they meant nothing because they were recipients of hospitality. But today, politically, they must not mean anything. They must not be visible. On the other hand, economically, they are everywhere, part of which the previous speaker spoke. And the classic justification of using the refugee or the immigrant as a cog in the world supply chain can be found out not only in India, but elsewhere in the literature. You've Alex Bates and Paul Collier and a host of others who think that by providing an economic solution, you solve the question of care and protection. And India, in that sense, only repeats the global thing. The local fight for an ethics of protection and care is on. Thank you.
You want to add something to that, what Ranavilla said, Urup Edulo?
Thank you, Prof, for that is thought-provoking, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I think that is thought-provoking, take about, whether the refugee is being integrated in the global supply chain, which is controlled outside our, our context. But it also, in a way, asks the question, why, for example, countries still maintain asylum as a facility, within the geopolitical system of international relations. So I don't think I have much to contribute, but I think that is really thought-provoking. We have to, navigate that area and find out why the situation persists. Thank you.
Urup?
I must say, Professor had absolutely reiterated what I presented when I was questioning whom are we accountable to? Are we really accountable to, I like this supply chain. Are we accountable to the supply chain of the international community, or are we really accountable to addressing the real needs? By all means, I mean it when I say real needs of refugees on the ground. And this is what we have been missing.
Yeah.
I'll give you the example, like when we created the industrial zone in the northeast of the country, the zone was created, companies from Europe were invited, free trade agreement was signed with Europe so that the products of these factories will go to Europe with no taxes. Lovely, that's beautiful. What has been created for the refugees? Nothing. How can they go to the work? Buses? Nothing. Their camps, even camps, Zaatari camp is about 45 minutes from Zaatari to go to the industrial area. How will they go there? Who will take care of their kids? What about education? Why can't you create, let's say, a housing setting within that factory so that people have schooling within the neighborhood, within the proximity? They have good health care within the proximity. They ensuring that when they leave home and come back home, they don't have this fear of how I will secure the well-being of my family. Who will protect the security of my family? Remember, there's something called security. This is another element. So what was addressed was how do we create the industrial area and how we bring in all the very unskilled refugees, again, with this idea that all the refugees are unskilled and they can fit into industrial field. Who told you that all the Syrians are into industrial fields? Who told you that? So is this the way that we do the self-reliance? So these kind of patterns or stereotyping, let's call it stereotyping people without even doing the analysis of who are these people, giving respect. I'm not so sure. I fail to understand why Jordan and Lebanon do not permit refugees to practice professionally their. Why not? Why can't we see them as an added value to our market, to our economy, to our people? By the way, when the Iraqis were permitted at the very beginning of the war, that was in the early 90s, when they permitted them to educate in the universities, one of the very unique professors were given the chance to be part of Jordanian universities. Why can't we create this ground where we are able to exchange knowledge, learn from each other? Why do I really need to tell you, you're a refugee, you are 10 steps below me because I'm a citizen? This issue of inequality, I believe, before talking about 51 Convention and its durable solutions, let's put the first ground is equality, equality, and equality, because this will be the ground based on which we will be able to deal with all the other solutions.
Oruba, thank you for these perfect final words. It's about you. It's about human rights. It's about the rights of refugees. I would like to make a final round so that every one of you has the chance. So, you know, the series of lecture is on 70 years of Geneva Convention, and we are discussing very currently here in the European Union that there will be more deals, governments in the global South. So this development that you described, that will be even worse in future as we fear. So what do you say about that? And what is your appeal to the governments here in the European Union? What should be changed and what they should do? Take the chance and leave a message to the governments here. Who wants to start with a final word?
I mean, my thing is that yes, but if European governments can stop thinking about the world and just why don't they decide this is European refugee policy once for all? We still don't know. We only know there is something called cordon sanitaire. We know many things. We know Frontex, we know border. But what is in Europe's refugee policy? Does anybody know? So let it rather concentrate and, you know, make its own home much more human rights oriented. That's all. Let it not think of how to make things good in Ghana or in India, Bangladesh.
Thank you. Very good. Orub.
Yeah, Europe refugee policy, well, it's Fortress Europe, whether we like it or not. It keeps it keeps creating these walls, whether we like it or not. It goes down. Merkel's politics did bring them down, and now it's being up. And I did mention what happened in September 2020 with the European decision that was very much pushing refugees to be out of Europe.
Yeah.
So some words. One of the words is protractedness. We need to understand that we cannot live happily in our houses while we are aware that there are big numbers of human beings that are stranded. I always call it between the earth and the sky. They cannot have proper legal status, and they fail to have any kind of solution. Their countries are now fragmented, cut, and they are everywhere. They are everywhere, whether in rural settings where they barely have proper rights. They are in informal tented settlements. We have lots of them in our region: Turkey, Lebanon, Syria itself, and in Jordan. Who's addressing the whole issue of the informal tented settlements? In a country like Jordan, we have 192 tented settlements. No one is mentioning anything about them. And these are things that are very much in the hide. So we have statelessness. We are as if all the politics of this protection of the 1951 Convention is very much pushing the world to take us to a level of statelessness. We're having more and more people who are unable to renew their passports. So they are living in countries that they are not their own countries with very illegal status. So are we to continue having this scenario, claiming that we are calling for human rights? And again, as if I'm just taking a step back and saying, shall we really once again think of the social, humane solutions beyond politics, beyond economy? Just think of something that talks to the human being before it talks to our politics as donors, our politics as big economists, our politics as just seeing a little bit through the socio-economic ground. This is the old call. This is the only major call. I feel that I need to bring it out because I'm seeing it every day, and it's stunning. I must admit that being in Turkey this morning, we were in a country that stunned me, that it's even in a country with the wealth of Turkey, that the refugees are saying the same issue, that I hear it in a country like Jordan with its very minimal resources. That tells us something, that it's the humane element that's missing completely.
Thank you. Dulu, you're the last. You also want to say something?
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for giving me the last one. I think let's be realistic. Migration is one of the survival tactics of human beings and all animals. So we must accept that a migration will continue. 2, the European Union must agree that they are part of the contribution of migration that they don't want. One, related to that is that because they have a population that is declining, that people have to accept to move, to come to Europe. It means when people come to Europe, they get opportunities to do other things that they are unable to do when they are in Yes, and finally, by the way, we cannot stop migration, but we can manage migration in a way. Development, as is conceived by European Union, will cause migration. Evidence shows that the fast developing countries are the ones that are likely to produce migrants. This happened in Europe in the 19th century, in the 18th century. So as Africa is developing right now, you will see more and more of migration. So the 1951 Convention is supposed to deal with only a small segment of migrants, and that's refugees. There are 300 million migrants in the world. So we have to find a way of dealing with that. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for this really important session and for this really important discussions. I wish everybody of you a lot of success for your work. Let's please keep in touch. And I hope to see you one day in person. So I wish you all a wonderful evening and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Christina, also.
Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, Lisa, also for the support, technical support.
Yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.